This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Dan O'Brien, K-State grain economist, begins today's show with a grain market update. He discusses the changes seen in the WASDE supply and demand balance sheets for corn, soybeans, grain sorghum, and wheat. Continuing the show is Kansas Agritourism Program Manager Kelsey Wendling, as she explains how people can get started in agritourism and a few crucial things to think about before jumping in. K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond finishes this week's shows with an update on the weather. He reminds people that they should be extra cautious when it comes to potential fires, especially with the wind and dryness. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update. And as always, we're joined with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thanks for joining us once again.
Thank you, Shelby.
Starting off our grain market conversation with how are futures looking?
In response to the USDA report that came out at 11 Central Time, generally we saw positive moves in the grains. The most, of course, in the soybeans. That's where the biggest change in the USDA's supply-demand balance sheets domestically occurred. But also support in the corn and kind of sympathetic support coming from wheat. If corn went up, wheat was going to as well in a competitive marketplace. But November soybeans closed at $12.90, up 37.5 cents. And that's a sizable positive response. There was some movement that's been occurring in the soybean meal market that was also supportive, as well as a shaving of U.S. projected yield, and we'll talk about that in more detail in just a minute. D's corn ended up at $4.96, the lead contract, up about 8 cents. And D's, Kansas hard red winter wheat, also closed up about 7 cents, 7.75. So as market days have gone, generally a positive response. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens in coming days once this news is digested, and then we start to look at export movement and other reports and information that comes out. So generally a positive response. It does set the stage now for further yield information coming in I believe it's the November 9th report, and then ultimately out into the January final report for the 2023. So still a ways to go, but we keep grinding towards eventually being about half. Well, we're approaching halfway through the corn harvest, and about the same for soybeans, as we're getting a better picture of what we have out in the fields. And again, give us one more month and we'll be able to hone in, I think, all that much more accurately on what our supply demand at least our supply situation is, and then we'll turn our attention to demand fully and move on from there in terms of price discovery.
How are cash prices doing?
Cash prices are, I guess I'm straining to want to say some statement about where cash prices are relative to costs, see if they're profitable or not. When you look at spot corn prices right now, again, at harvest, basically for most folks, we're hovering around, $4.81 in Topeka, Columbus, eastern part of the state, $5.21 in Garden City. And generally, if we're blessed with decent yields, we're around break-even costs, a little bit more. So I think, of course, ag producers, if they are blessed with good yields, then they're in all that much better of a shape. If not, it strains the cost per unit. But overall, we're not far from cost production estimates on irrigated and non-irrigated corn. Grain sorghum still, as we've talked about in recent weeks, still see some export demand showing up, a strong price in the Hutchinson area at $5.51. Most elevators are not at that level, but there are one or two terminals that is the top price that's out there. So, and that basically is stronger than any corn price that we're seeing around. Pretty strong relative even to the ethanol plants in the state for corn. Other prices that are looking pretty good: $5.36 in the Salina area, $5.11 in both Colby and Garden City for the top price, $5.06 Topeka. A little weaker, $4.61 in Columbus for grain sorghum right now. For soybeans, the run-up that happened in the futures reflected in the cash prices. You're looking at a high of, again in the Hutchinson area, about $12.54 as the highest price. Again, most country elevators are somewhat below that. That's a terminal that put out that top price. Again, $12.45 in Salina, pretty strong price. $12.35 Topeka, $12.05, $11.95 in Garden City and Colby. For wheat, again, even with that 7 cents increase. Again, that was reflected in the markets, but we're still seeing prices about on the top end of about 650, 655, and that's Salina, Topeka, Hutchinson, and a little bit lower in the Garden City area, 615, 590 in Colby. What's interesting now is also to look out towards next year's forward contract bids. So people are, as we're into October, we're sowing wheat in a lot of areas, particularly with some moisture that's come through of late. You're looking at forward bids for 2024 crop at the highest in the Topeka area. Interesting. 663 is a forward contract bid. Hutchinson, 653, 643, 633 thereabouts in Colby, and 638 in Columbus. So are these at or above KSU cost of production estimates? Generally, whereas we used to kind of hang our hat on about $4 for wheat, if in our budgets we plug in 40, 45 bushels, these aren't that far above break-even numbers. But if we get 55, 60, 65, we drop our per unit costs, and these would be quite profitable. So we're looking at a situation where at so average yields, I don't want to criticize them, of 35, 40 bushels, and again, most producers are hoping for a lot more than that, then we're about break-even or so. But if we get higher yields, then we'll be doing a lot better. So again, you're looking at the prospects that affect agricultural producers in Kansas. It's ultimately a moisture and production oriented enterprise that we're dealing with, and from there we try to manage the marketing the best we can.
The USDA did on the 12th put out their World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates. And Dan, what were a few things you saw in that were interesting domestically?
Well, we were watching the yields. For corn, the USDA did lower its estimate of the U.S. average corn yield from 173.8 to 173, and that was not a given that would happen. In fact, there's several very credible commercial groups that had predicted yields to move back somewhat higher, but came in at 173.0 per acre as a U.S. estimated corn yields. Again, some states higher, some states lower. I think the Kansas number was down about 5 bushels per acre. So in future reports, we'll talk more about that. But the overall U.S. number is just over 15 billion bushels. And by the time you run through the supply-demand balance sheets, the little bit of shaving of the export number, a little bit of reduction in feed and residual from what had been in the September report, you end up at, again, 2.1 billion bushels carry out. Stocks to use about 14.7%, a little bit higher prices, about $4.95. We were at $4.90 as a projection coming out of September. So again, we're far enough into this now in terms of yield reports, or we'd be just really, really surprised if the ending stocks, if the supply-demand balance sheet worked out in a way that dropped ending stocks another 100, 200 million bushels below 2 billion and really put us into a tight situation. So I guess for the industry sake of users, this is more of a moderate price that should help livestock feeders and energy users and exporters to be able to procure or move product a little bit better. So they're hoping. I would say also on soybeans, if anything, probably the surprise, a bigger surprise would be that the USDA's projection of, I think it was about 50.1 bushels per acre dropped to 49.6. And I'm sure there'll be people that are wondering if that will drop more in the upcoming November report. But they did see a reduction in the U.S. average yield down to below 50 bushels per acre, down to 49.6, about a 4.1 billion bushel crop. You run that through the supply-demand balance sheet and shave exports about 35 million, add about 10 to crush, which is kind of the trend we're going. We're stronger crush, weaker exports. Generally, that is our trend. Ending stocks still at 220 million bushels, and just kind of an emerging idea that trade isn't willing right now at this point to concede that we would drop below 200 million bushels in terms of ending stocks for soybeans, and that'd be down to 5.2%. We certainly have gone there in the past, but there's resistance right now. The idea of trigger rationing, prices move a lot higher. So anyway, we came out of that report for corn and soybeans, the two biggest players with that change. One thing I should add in for grain sorghum, there was a sharp drop in the U.S. grain sorghum yields and production. In essence, we dropped the yield number down from 60.9 to 57.4 bushels per acre, shaved about 21 million bushels off of the off of the production number down to 360 and reduced exports about 10 million. So for grain sorghum, I'm out here in the Western Plains, was a recipient of tougher weather conditions early on in the season and then at times later on. And we've seen it in our neighborhood out here in Western Kansas and in parts of it, and showed up on the supply-demand balance sheet. Prices for sorghum basically matching corn right now, although as you and I have just talked about, cash prices for sorghum at this point are a little bit higher, but still for the marketing year, the USDA's, I guess, taking a more of a conservative line and just saying, well, they're the same until we know better. So
kind of sounds like there's been a fair amount of movement in those supply and demand balance sheets. However, is that holding steady then for corn as well?
I think that the area of movement that we'd seen for corn was to reduce feed residual usage by about 25 million bushels compared to the 5.6 billion that's projected to be used is a small change. It's more of an on-the-edge adjustment. Since we're talking a little bit about feed and residual use for corn, wheat's a competitor. And when you look at the feed residual usage figure for wheat, one, I guess, advantage of lower prices for wheat is that now it's much more readily fed. It becomes more of a competitor for corn. And maybe that's some of the trade-off we've seen in those other feed grains, in that the feed residual usage number for wheat was increased by 30 million up to, from 90 up to 120. So where does that happen at? Well, places like Southwest Kansas, wherever there are feedlots at, now it's that much more of a competitive situation. Generally, if there's a rule of thumb, we look at 105 to 110% of, if wheat gets down to 105 to 110% of corn, then generally it becomes more of a competitive option for wheat feeding. And this is where we've gotten to now in the wheat market, and that we've dropped far enough that, hey, it looks like wheat feeding probably is more of a possible enterprise.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Friday show discussing agritourism. And to talk about agritourism, we're joined with Kansas Agritourism Program Manager Kelsey Wendling. Kelsey, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely.
Before we kind of dive into some different things that your program can help with, first off, what is agritourism?
So agritourism is the joining of traditional tourism with agriculture education in the state of Kansas. And we realize that ag production is one of our major economic impacts in the state. And so this is a great way for people to get their foot in the door, learn about what agriculture is, but also have a fun experience.
So really a twofold then for maybe consumers learning and maybe the producers having a little bit of an additional income.
Absolutely. So it's a great secondary income source for producers, but then closing that gap between the general population and agriculture.
And this time of year, I think of pumpkin patches a lot when I think of agritourism. However, there's so much more.
So we have over 430 registered agritourism operations in the state of Kansas, and they vary tremendously. I think on our website we have over 32 categories of agritourism operations, range from pumpkin patch, Christmas tree farms, hunting operations, country stays, your normal farm, livestock production you can go visit. Wineries is another big one in Kansas. So they kind of cover the whole gambit of anything you can grow or raise, and you want the general public to come visit you. You can definitely be an agritourism operation.
And something in agritourism, producers, I think, get caught in that this is something they've always done. However, to others, it could be really cool.
Absolutely. So I think a lot of people who are in it day in and day out think, why would anybody want to come to the farm and see this? They find some of the struggles of agriculture on a day-to-day basis frustrating, but the general public who is so far removed, they don't know where their food's coming from, find it so fascinating. So if you're already doing chores, you can have someone pay to come help you do chores. So I think that's what the disconnect between what agritourism is and general, your just regular tourism.
And for someone who maybe is already disconnected a little bit from the farm, per se they had a grandparent or an aunt or uncle, they can still go into agritourism.
Absolutely. So for the general consumer who had the grandpa or grandma who owned the farm, it's a great place to come back to. They love those memories. And then for the producer who had a grandma or grandpa who farmed back in the day, can kind of pay homage to those by doing something smaller scale, potentially, and letting the public come on and honor them in that way.
And Kelsey, you mentioned that there's over 30 different categories on the website where people can find different agritourism opportunities. And a lot of times that involves different levels of agritourism as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So a lot of producers, I think of the pumpkin patches that are the full-fledged operations. You have the educational component, the growing component, but also the really fun component where kids come to the farm, play all day, and learn. But also we have producers who have small winery operations where people can walk through the vineyard and learn about different grapes, try the wine. We also have just traditional agriculture individuals who want to help educate. So they just do their regular farming operations, take care of livestock, grow crops. People come and ride in combines. They can ride in the tractor. They can experience a harvest. So it's a very wide gambit of kind of what agritourism is. The act that was written in 2004 to kind of promote agritourism was written very broadly. And so it encompasses all types, which was the general purpose of the act.
And Kelsey, you're involved with the program that's helping support agritourism across Kansas. And so I'm assuming you've worked with many different producers. And what are a few things that sometimes you see producers forget about when they're looking into agritourism?
So one of the biggest things I see is producers are great at growing and producing all kinds of agricultural outputs, but then they forget to market. And so people don't come to the farm unless they know that you're open to the farm. And so one thing we help a lot of producers with is starting a Facebook page, starting a website. What's the best practices if you're selling online? So those things we definitely run into. And then also, depending on what type of agritourism operation you own, getting the right licensing, working with your county is a big thing to make sure that all that you want to have on your operation is allowed. If you're doing an Airbnb country stay, make sure that your county allows those.
And something else important for protecting the farmer and the people who are there, insurance and liability.
Absolutely. So with the Promotion Act that was set up in 2004, it does give a limited liability protection as one of the benefits to opening your operation to the public, which is great, but this is limited. So we always encourage producers to get some type of insurance. Work with your insurance agent that you currently have and see if there's an agritourism clause you can add. And then we also have more resources on our website as well. But it's always strongly encouraged to have insurance to cover your bases.
And Kelsey, how can your program help people?
Like I mentioned, the limited liability is a huge factor in the agritourism program and getting signed up, but we also do free marketing. So we realize that producers are great at what they do, but they lack sometimes that marketing component. And so when you register with the state, you get that free listing on our website at the state level at our tourism website. And then also we have a Facebook page that we promote all types of operations throughout the year, special events. We have a Feature Friday business post that we do every week. And so marketing is a huge component that we offer as a benefit. And then we also have educational opportunities throughout the year, different things we notice producers are asking for or need. We can work on getting speakers, produce webinars, videos to help educate and do networking as well.
And so what is that website for people who are wanting to find more information?
So it's travelks.com. And we have the consumer-facing side of the website, which is where the listings will be and people looking for certain activities can find. And then also at the top of that website, there's a yellow banner and it has a travel industry tab. And that's more for the producer side. If you're looking for more information about the program itself, what all it entails, you can go to that travel industry tab and then it'll have the agritourism program and all kinds of resources.
Also has the resources for maybe what different licensing you can find and if you want to go see other agritourism businesses before you do your own.
Absolutely. So we have different producers. You can contact me and I can get you in contact with other producers who are willing to share their successes, their downfalls, kind of what they did along the way. We have tons of those in Kansas who are willing to share their experience. We also have links to our National Agritourism Organization that we're a part of. There is a fee to join that, but we can definitely get connected. And then we also have a How to Be an Agritourism manual. And so it's quite a large manual all online, but it takes you step by step on what you need to do, if agritourism is right for you, and you can read over that, and that's all posted on the website.
And Kelsey, as you've worked with all of these different businesses and organizations, what makes you love seeing them go out and about and do it?
One thing that drew me into agritourism is I grew up in Wichita, Kansas, and I was not in agriculture growing up whatsoever, but I have 2 degrees in agriculture. I'm just fascinated with the agriculture industry. And so I love that agritourism kind of breaks down those walls and is transparent about agriculture production. And so it's great to watch people kind of go from, I don't know where my food comes from, to walking through a vineyard and realizing this is where my wine comes from. Holy cow. And so just that connection of the light kind of coming on and having a new appreciation for the agriculture industry that they may not have had, and then seeing how the producers benefit from that. And the interactions, it's amazing to watch, and it's so fun to have those. You hear the questions that the population's asking to the farmers, and their responses is always great.
Kelsey, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us a little bit of information about agritourism in Kansas.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
That was Kansas Agritourism Program Manager Kelsey Wendling. And the website she mentioned was travelks.com, and I will link it in today's show notes, which, as always, you're able to find on agtoday.net. We're now going to be joined by Scarlett Higgins from the Kansas Livestock Association as she discusses how ranchers who experienced grazing losses due to drought or wildfire in the last 2 years may be eligible for additional disaster relief payments.
The Farm Service Agency has begun issuing more than $581 million to eligible ranchers through the Emergency Livestock Relief Program. These payments will help those recovering from drought and wildfire in 2021 and 2022. Ranchers who lost grazing acres due to these natural disasters in 2021 and received assistance through Emergency Livestock Relief Program Phase 1 soon will receive an additional payment. This second payment will be equal to 20% of the 2021 gross Phase 1 payment. Phase 2 payments, which are estimated to total $115.7 million, will be automatic with no application required. In 2022, ranchers continued to experience significant loss of grazing acres due to drought and wildfire. To help mitigate these losses, eligible ranchers will receive Emergency Livestock Relief Program disaster assistance payments for increases in supplemental feed cost. To expedite payments, determine producer eligibility, and calculate the 2022 payment, FSA is using livestock inventories and drought-affected forage acreage or restricted animal units and grazing days due to wildfire already reported to the agency by ranchers when they submitted their livestock forage disaster program applications. Emergency Livestock Relief Program payments for 2022 losses are estimated at $465.4 million and also will be automatic with no application required. For more information, contact your local FSA office. I'm Scarlett Higgins.
That was Kansas Livestock Association's Scarlett Higgins. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with a weather update with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, first topic of conversation when thinking about the weather for this week has been pretty windy.
Yes, we've definitely seen an uptake in wind. You know, we're getting these contrasting air masses of warm temperatures surging with southerly winds, and then cold fronts bring gusty northerly winds, and that battle back and forth means that we kind of end up right in the middle of it all. And we get a little share of each, and the winds associated with both, unfortunately. Very breezy, which is pretty normal for this time of year. It means we're getting into a stormier time of the year, which unfortunately, as we'll talk about, doesn't bring a lot of moisture, but will bring probably the most prevalent impact as wind.
Thinking of wind, also a good time to mention keeping fire danger in mind for people.
Yeah, you know, things are drying out, and especially with the drought across most of central and eastern Kansas, a lot of those grasses are already cured out and brown, and fire just needs about an hour for things to dry out before fire can get established. I know there's been a lot of small fires, especially the days with moderate wind, and mainly because we just haven't quite seen that freeze component yet to really help dry the landscape. But fire is definitely an increasing concern. We need to think about mitigation in advance of a fire and just kind of going over our typical pattern of are all the burnables away from our house and that sorts of thing.
With the dryness, also, we have had some warmth, though, this past week and probably going to continue with it.
even with the strong cold front that we had go through overnight and into early Friday, we're going to keep temperatures pretty moderated really for the next several days, and mainly due to the amount of moisture. We just had a lot of humidity, and that's helped offset some of those fire weather concerns, but at the same time is keeping us warmer at night, which is helping avoid the freeze problem, but also keeping us gradually above normal. Our average lows this time of year range from 40 to 45 degrees with average highs around the 70-degree upper 60s. And we've been overachieving it quite a few days over the last week. Yeah, we've had some cooler days in there, but mostly we're averaging above normal.
And Chip, you mentioned having moisture this time of year, but it not looking like rain. And this past week, most places saw that.
Yeah, I'm talking ambient moisture in the atmosphere, especially with southerly flow. We get kind of that Gulf moisture. But unfortunately, the precipitation's been trending all north of us. Areas in Nebraska and South Dakota are expected to get inches of rain over the next several days. But for the most part, Kansas has stayed high and dry outside of a few scattered storms, mostly in the northeast. And unfortunately, as we look kind of forward, this storm track isn't favoring a good moisture influx that can fall in the form of precipitation. Most of it's going up and over us into our north and leaving us dry.
And Chip, you mentioned a freeze that we experienced a little bit earlier this weekend. Can we be expecting another one?
Yeah, we had that freeze. It was mostly in isolated areas and valleys, and then kind of the Hayes region and southward, and even further east in the Kansas River Valley. But, we haven't had that widespread freeze, and it looks like we're going to keep moisture around, cloud cover around. That should keep temperatures up to the weekend. Clouds will clear out come Monday and Tuesday as high pressure starts to build back in. And I think that'll be when we have potential for a much more widespread freeze with clearing skies and a dry air mass. Temperatures can fall pretty quickly. And so Monday morning, Tuesday morning, looking like cold days, and we'll likely see some widespread freezes as a result. That'll help launch a lot of this vegetation into dormancy for the winter, and in turn will play a role in kind of how the dynamics in the atmosphere works out over the next week to 2 weeks.
And looking how the tropics could impact the rest of our month.
The models have been flip-flopping all around. There was a hurricane that made landfall in Mexico that we thought was going to have an influx of moisture northward. But this cold front ended up being stronger than expected, and it looks like it's going to shunt all that moisture off to our south and east. Now we're looking to the West Pacific, where Typhoon Bolivan has been very prominent. It's been upper end, kind of the highest potential typhoon you could ever see. But the good news is it's not hitting anything. The bad news is it's going to play a role into the weather pattern as it moves north and gets sucked into the northern jet stream. It's going to result in a pretty impactful storm for the Alaska region, which is going to buckle the pattern downstream and east of that. Guess what? That's western and central United States. It helped reinforce high pressure across the west. This will likely mean that we'll trend probably at to slightly above normal temperatures and would keep us in a pretty dry flow probably for the next week to 2 weeks.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.